We are pleased to welcome our first lecturer today, Ståle Holgerson, senior lecturer in human geography at Stockholm University and prominent voice in critical political ecology. In his lecture, Ecosocialism Against the Crisis of Capitalism, Holgerson will explore how both economic and ecological crises are not anomalies, but integral features of capitalism, and drawing on insights from his recent book, Against the Crisis, he will challenge the idea that crisis inherently leads to progressive change and argue for eco-socialist alternative. With focus on the intersection of class struggle, climate activism, and systemic transformation, his talk will promises a thought-provoking analysis of the paths beyond capitalist crisis. The floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you for organizers for inviting me. Great to be here. Never been here before. Beautiful city. Thank you, Bosjan, especially for communication and invitation and for a nice introduction. And the thing he ended with not having a real answer to how to organize the green transition from below. I really think that is true and a very important question. I'll part to intervene a little bit in that discourse. I don't have the big answer, I'm afraid, but hopefully I will try to steer direction in the right, and the conversation in the right direction. Okay, maybe I should try to speak slow as well if there is a translation. I didn't think about it. All right. Okay, so I will do two things. I will present two very related things. I will present the core arguments in the new book, Against the Crisis, which came out just a few months ago. And I also had a book launch in Paris just this weekend. So I do have 4 or 5 copies with me if somebody wants to buy a copy for a cheap price afterwards. And I will introduce the main arguments. And then, secondly, speak a little bit about transition, the idea about how socialists can meet these crises. And then end with some general reflections on the some common discourses and limitations in the current eco-Marxist or eco-socialist debate. All right? Okay, so the book is about crisis, and it goes without saying that that's quite a relevant concept today. We live in the 2020s. And so far in this decade, what did we have? We have the pandemic, we had inflation, we had energy crisis, we had the so-called cost of living crisis, we had escalating climate change, we had one more. We have some of the biggest stock exchange crashes in the history of capitalism. We had wars around the globe. We had Donald Trump. We had the tariff things. And we have ongoing live stream genocide in Gaza. And it's only 2025. We're only halfway through this decade. So it goes without saying that in these kind of circumstances, people go to concepts like crisis. Understandable. Now, there is a problem here that everything cannot be everything. So there's this tendency to call everything crisis. And as we are in a situation where we have a lot of turbulence, shocks, crisis, I think we need a definition about, okay, what is a crisis, what is not a crisis? Because this will have different implications for how we respond to different things. Okay, so for example, the concept of polycrisis, which I think we will discuss more tomorrow as well. I think so there are a lot of people writing about polycrisis, some doing it much more better than others. But I think in general, it comes with 2 general limitations. That is also the general limitations in how we speak about crisis in general. One is the lack of definition of what is a crisis. It can mean everything's associated with something bad. And the second is how are these crises related, apart from the effects of one crisis affecting the effects of another crisis. Okay, so I will come back to both those things in my lecture. First, definition of crisis. Where do we even start? So in this book, I try to do a definition, which might be a bold move, and feel free to disagree with this definition. I will give you my definition soon. But I'm very happy if you disagree. That's fine. I like disagreements. But with definitions, we can disagree. Without definitions, we cannot even disagree. We can only have confusion. And I prefer disagreements to confusion. So when trying to find out how to define crisis, I think there's two mistakes we should avoid. One is going to the classical one, going to the encyclopedia or going to the ancient Greece. Yeah, really, crisis meant X. And then you often you have a synonym. What is a crisis? And you think this is the crisis. That way of trying to figure out the definition misses the fact that language develops over time, especially over 2,000 years, and the phenomena we try to describe with our words are also changing. So it's become natural in the way humans communicate that the concepts do change over time. The other mistake we can do is to say to the other pole, everything goes. If you say this is a crisis, how might say that's an elephant, for example? If this is a way of communicating, everything goes, everything have the right to have their own definition of crisis, we all have a mess. It's very hard to communicate. Okay, so building on this, I try to find a definition being sensitive to the history, being sensitive to how we speak about it and common sense, but more important, what kind of phenomena in the real world, what kind of things going on in the real world do we try to capture with saying crisis? Okay, so here we go with definition. Building on Bob Jessop, for example, speaking about symptomatology. The crises are symptoms of something underlying. Or Daniel Ben Zaid, speaking about crisis as paroxysms. That's a sudden outbreak of a known disease. I suggest the following definition. Here we go. Crisis is some kind of turning point in history, necessarily based on three components. First, it's an event happening relatively fast. This event is, second, rooted in underlying structure and processes. And this must, third, have negative consequences for human or nature somehow. Without the first one, we can have all kind of permanent things going on. Without the second one, we can have things happening by chance. And without the third one, we can things that hypothetically are good for everyone, and we just need to rule it out of the definition. This means that crises are always events and underlying structures. Always. It's in the definition of the concept. And I'm coming from the Marxist tradition, and there's no doubt that in my tradition there is way too much focus on the underlying processes. The real explanation for the crisis. That's the main focus. But that's politically irrelevant when a crisis hits. Then we also need to speak to the event, the crisis as an event. How it hits people, make people unemployed, kill people, etc. Okay. This definition is broad. And it needs to be broad because there are tons of, or a lot of, things in the real world that need to be explained with this concept. But it's not so broad that it includes everything. For example, poverty is not a crisis. Poverty is something relatively permanent in capitalism. It doesn't come and go. It doesn't like suddenly you have more poverty and there's a lot of politicians trying to do everything they can to fix it or whatever. It comes to another shock. It's just there. So there can be more or less poverty. There can be more poverty because of a crisis. Or poverty can even trigger political crisis if there is struggle against it. But as a concept itself, if you try to understand poverty, you should not run to crisis theory to try to understand it. You should try to understand other mechanisms in capitalism. Wars, similar thing. Wars are wars, crises are crises. They are not simply the same thing. I also work a lot of housing studies, especially in housing studies. People are obsessed with the concept of housing crisis. Everything is housing crisis. If prices are too high, it's housing crisis. Prices are too low, it's housing crisis. And homelessness, for example, similar point, is not a crisis. Homelessness is homelessness, crisis is crisis. Okay? So if you try to understand homelessness, which you should, and go study it, try to fight it, but crisis theory might not be the best place to start. Okay, so this is the definition I work with. So everything I say from now on about crisis is with this definition. Okay, and it comes with a lot of implications we will come back to. So in this book, then, I have two main arguments that kind of drives through the book. One is that capitalism produces crisis, and the other is that crisis reproduce capitalism. Okay, those two arguments sound very similar. I basically just changed the order of the sentence, but they are extremely different and come with massive different way of viewing the world. Okay, so if you first look at how the first argument, how crises produce, sorry, I always mess up, how capitalism produces crisis, we see how the system produces one crisis after another. And this is the common way of seeing the phenomena from a leftist perspective, a Marxist perspective very often. And from this perspective, you see the system just producing shitloads of problems and crises and all that. And from this side of looking at it, the system looks fragile, it looks weak, it looks like it's going to produce its own way of going into a collapse all the time. It looks like it's going under. This is one way of looking at the world. If we change position and look at the crisis from another perspective, how these crises are not only coming, but also going. So economic crisis, but definitely ecological crises are a little bit different because they're coming, going, and coming. I can return to that. But we look at, from this perspective, how the system seems to be able to handle all these crises. The world looks very different. If you see crisis from this perspective, how the system does not seem to go under as soon as there's a crisis, but rather the opposite. Capitalism seems to be able to survive any kind of crisis. It seems even to come out strengthened out of the crisis. From this perspective, the system looks extremely flexible, able to adapt to anything, and it seems impossible that the system will go under any time. Okay, so here we have two very different arguments, two very different perspectives. What I try to do is look at both and integrate them. Yeah, that's kind of the main, one of the main things driving this book. Okay? So where this first argument is more or less, this is a basic leftist argument that we're producing crisis. This other one is more controversial in leftist societies maybe. A lot of people think that climate change might end capitalism. I'm skeptical, sorry to say. I hope it was. I'll come back to that. But from this perspective, I also criticize a lot of collapse theory that seems to, never disappear from leftist milieux. All right, so let me then, for the next 10 minutes, very shortly, take you through these two arguments. How the system produces crisis, how crisis reproduces the system. So, and I have two different methodologies to try to understand this. And I will go, there's a lot of things going to happen now on the PowerPoint there. There'll be a lot of things. I don't have time to go into details. We must leave that for later. I'm here tonight and tomorrow, so please come and ask or whatever. I will go fairly quickly through them because I will also emphasize strategies and stuff afterwards. Okay? So if we start with the first approach, how capitalism produces crisis. Remember, my definition said a crisis is always an event and underlying structures. Always. So this means that the crisis is always on different levels of abstraction, per definition. So when I give my definition, it's two levels, event and underlying. But it could be more. The way we categorize these layers is up to us. That's a human discourse action. In this book, I tried to have 5 different levels. It could be 100. It's not like reality is stopping me from doing 100. But of course, it's very hard to understand on your own head, 100 levels, and it's impossible to try to communicate it. So I tried with 5 levels, and then we tried these 2 crises then, economic and ecological, on 5 levels. And see what happens. Okay? Sorry. So, on economic crisis, as I said, this will go a little bit fast, but let's run through it. The important here is the way of thinking levels and abstractions and the relation, and not the relation between the 2 crises and relation to capitalism. Okay, economic level 1. We know this before. We've seen this is economic crisis when it hits the news. 29, 33, 2008, 2020. When it's like this shock, everybody expects the politicians to do something. The crisis is there. Fine. And afterhand, a lot of people will say, yeah, of course it needed to be a crisis because the shock was so great. But a lot of shocks do not cause crisis. When was it? 5th of August last year? Anybody remember what happened 5th of August last year? No, we don't, and we don't care. It was one of the biggest stock exchange crashes in the history of capitalism. And we don't care. Why? Because it didn't lead to a crisis. It could have, but it didn't. If it did, everybody would be explaining how they see this was coming, but it didn't. So, in order to understand how some crashes, some events lead to crisis and others don't, we need to go down to level 2. Into what kind of organizing or organization of capitalism at a certain time does this event hit? Okay? On level 2, we can just speak about regimes of accumulation or technological regimes, and we can conventionally use concepts like Fordism and neoliberalism, etc. And that might explain why also in 1987 there was a massive stock exchange crash that did not lead to a crisis. It was, just to speak very bluntly, when neoliberalism was fairly strong and growing, but 2008 was when it was maybe on decay. But this in itself does not tell us why it's a crisis. Just because we have Fordism or neoliberalism doesn't explain the fact that this system necessarily produces economic crisis. How do we figure out that? Down to level 3, and this is inherent tendencies in capitalism. And just to say it very shortly, there are some different discussions in the critical literature in Marxist debates. 2 main debates are overproduction and increasing organic composition of capital. This is long discussions in itself. Just going to do it super quickly. That the theory of overproduction says there's a tendency in capitalism to produce more commodities than can be consumed. Thus, it would lead to some kind of accumulation problems and crises, and or at least make the system more crisis-prone. The increasing organic composition of capital says there's 2 tendencies. One saying that one saying that machines will replace labor in a conventional process under capitalism, but other tendencies saying it's only labor that produces more value. Okay, this is a little technique, and if you don't care about economic theory, I'm soon finished. But these 2 tendencies will then lead to the fact that on the overall system, the amount of labor will diminish, which will be a problem because it's only labor that produces more value. Okay, and this makes us the more crisis-prone. So my take on this, and this is a civil war going on with the Marxists, my take on this, building on Ernst Mandel, is that these 2 processes can coexist at the same time. Indeed, several processes can exist at the same time. We don't have to look for one process that drives every single economic crisis. Okay, let's pause the levels there and go to ecological crisis. On level 1, we found heat waves, storms, forest fires, pandemics, etc. When ecological crisis hits people, kills people, damages people and people's lives. So how can we think about levels of abstraction here? Well, for example, take heat waves. Oh, take wildfires. So there was wildfires before capitalism, before global warming, and there are wildfires now, but there are more wildfires now. And there would be wildfires today without global warming, but we don't know which ones would have, or it's hard to know, which ones would not have been here if it wasn't for global warming. We only know there's more. In order to understand these kind of levels or discussions, we need to go down to level 2, into what kind of organization of capital does these events happen. And here we can place use of fossil fuels, poisons, capitalist animal husbandry, deforestation, etc. And I would then, how can we go even further down? Can we go into some inherent tendencies in crisis in capitalism? A lot of people would, a lot of comrades I respect, would place fossil fuel on level 3. But I will also remind that we did have capitalism for a while without fossil fuel. I think capitalism can exist even post-fossil fuel. I'm not 100% sure, but at least in theory and maybe even practically it's possible, given that the system is flexible. But we don't know. But what's kind of the inherent tendency that's necessarily there that make this system unsustainable? That necessarily produces a gap between humans and nature. That necessarily make the fact, because this is older than global warming and older than the use of fossil fuel, that humans under capitalism are destroying the earth. So what's kind of the inherent tendency there? And I go to John Benjamin Foster and use the metabolic rift. I imagine most people in this room are familiar with it. There are problems with the term. Does that mean that we should heal the rift? Is it even possible? But I think among those words where we're trying to describe that there is a gap that came with capitalism between humans and nature that wasn't there before, I think metabolic rift is the least poor one. Okay, so far on these levels, I've seen 2 crises on 3 levels, and my argument would be that so far we have seen no relation between the 2 crises. So far, these 2 crises could be on different planets. They do not belong to each other. And when I started writing this book, this was a very hard and strong argument. I started writing the book in 2019. It was a very hard argument. And this is, of course, a critique of a bunch of people who argue that economic crises come because of ecological crisis. We can find this in Ricardo and in Malthus and Limits to Growth reports and in James O'Connor and in Jason Moore and others. So I started also with a hard critique of this. No, economic crises do not come out of ecological problems. It comes out of contradictions in capitalism. That was my main argument. 2019. Then a few weeks later, 2020, the pandemic, which of course was an ecological crisis triggering an economic one. That was not supposed to happen in my theory, so I had my own little crisis there. And I needed to be a little bit more humble on the argument, tone it down. And yes, this was maybe the first O'Connor moment, somebody called it, James O'Connor moment. And there is something there. Ecological crisis then, of course, can trigger an economic crisis. Fine. But I will insist, defending my original argument, we have not seen any necessarily relation between 2 crises yet. And of course, just to make this clear, the economy affect ecology, and ecology affect economy, and economic crisis affect ecological crisis, vice versa, in all kind of ways at top levels. It's like, of course, when there's an economic crisis, thing happens with the ecology just because there's lower economic growth or anything. There's all kind of relations, but now I'm trying to look at what's the necessarily relations, how are they necessarily related. And so far, I think, apart from the fact that they might trigger each other then, we have not seen any necessarily relation. Well, what happens if you open up books 4 and 5? Well, if you add profit motive, the necessarily drive for profits under capitalism on level 4, we suddenly have a different picture. Now the 2 crises are not only related, suddenly they become the same. And this is the thing with the economic and ecological crisis. They are both different crises and the same crisis at the same time, depending on levels of abstraction. So this is also an intervention then to discussions between John Bellamy Foster and Jason Moore. But John Bellamy Foster said these 2 crises are different. Jason Moore saying, no, everything is one. It's one crisis. And of course, as an event, remember, crisis also always events. As an event, it just doesn't make sense to say wildfire is the same as a bank crash. Just nonsense. But if you go down on levels of abstraction, 4 and 5 in my table, you do have an argument. So Moore Foster depends on levels of abstraction. And we can even go further down, use value, exchange value, just to make it into more theoretical. And those who are into that can read the book. I will just move forward quickly here now. Thank you. All right, so this was how capitalism produces crisis. So if we're going to look at how crisis reproduce capitalism, we need a different approach. So here I just made a figure to try and figure out on levels of abstraction. To try to figure out how crisis reproduce capitalism, I start from a classical critical realist perspective, saying that, okay, if you look at history and we accept the fact that crises do not fall under crises, but seems to be able to reproduce through crisis, what must the world look like in order for that to be true? Okay, which kind of social processes in the real world must exist in this way in order for that to be true? Because we've given its truth through empirical observations. Okay, so I just, in this sense, in this way of this approach, I just go through a bunch of things, basically, just of different aspects that I think make it clear to understand why this is the case. And I will also do this very, very quickly. Just in... checking out timer. I will... we can do it quickly. Maybe see if I go through all or skip last few ones. So let's just take quickly a few of them. Crisis itself. Here we must make a distinction between the two crises. With economic crisis, the system need the crisis as a crisis. With economic crisis, there's contradictions growing in the system that needs the crisis in order to reproduce and rechange and reorganize itself as a crisis. We can call this creative destruction. And that's the important part for the economy to be reproduced in itself. So the capitalist economy don't need ecological crisis. It don't need wildfires, and it doesn't need global warming to exist, but it needs to produce ecological crisis in order to exist in the first place. Second, shock. And here I build very much on Naomi Klein's fantastic book, Shock Doctrine, which she has the argument that when there is, and she's speaking about neoliberalism and US foreign policies, but I think this is a general argument, when there is a sense of shock and urgency, those already having military, economic, ideological, political power are the ones best positioned to use that shock. Okay, and I think that's just a general rule that's kind of true. I think this shock and urgency also places limits on radical thinking. For example, climate change. So shock, crisis is something happening relatively fast and relatively important. They kind of demand some immediate response to it. With the economic crisis, we're speaking about, of course, days and weeks and months. Climate change, it's coming also, maybe depends how you see the temporality of it, coming extremely fast, and we need to phase out fossil fuel within a decade or two. It's an extreme operation. It's extremely short time, and the question, as all of you know, is extremely important. This combination, something extremely important, something extremely severe, happening relatively fast, brings over and over again in history radical people into the center. That's why we bow down and say, okay, we accept the Hillary Clintons and Joe Bidens of the world, because the alternative is Donald Trump. This is where revolutionary over and over again go to Keynesianism and the political center and social democracy to find solutions, because the situation is such a shock. Okay, I'll come back to this later. 3, relative autonomy of the state. Elmar Altvater, the German Green Marxist, had an interesting book about crisis in 1993, where he could not avoid, of course, seeing the fact that half the world had just disappeared politically due to a huge political crisis. Soviet Union was gone. His argument in the book is that one of the reasons Soviet Union collapsed was that when there was an economic crisis, people will directly look to the politicians and say, fix it. Because in this so-called democracy, or whatever we're going to call it, politicians were responsible for the economy. So in reality, this is also a messy system with a complex and all that, but that's how they try to frame it, at least politically. In capitalism, it's different. So in capitalism, there is a relative autonomy between the different spheres, for example, the economy and the political. So when there is an economic crisis, politicians can say, well, it was not my fault, and it's partly correct. It doesn't matter what a single politician do in a certain moment, they cannot avoid something like 2008 or 73 or 2020 crisis, for example. But the same politicians can then step forward and say, yeah, but relax, I'm going to fix it for you. Might succeed or might fail, but that's kind of intervene in a very different way than dictators can when there's no relative autonomy. Similar thing with climate change. Politicians can say, well, it's not my fault because it's been going on for so long, but we will try to fix it for you. So there's relative autonomy between the spheres all the time, make them get away with anything, so to speak. All right. 4th, the class character of the crisis. So imagine this. How would the world react to global warming if the richest died first? So was the very first to die because of global warming was Elon Musk, and then Bezos, and then Zuckerberg, and then all the dollar billionaires. And imagine this. When temperature hit 1.5 degrees, all the main CEOs, all the main lawyers, all the richest and most corrupt politicians in the world, all dead. Okay, I'm not going to bring the bad news here, but that's, of course, not how reality is. But climate change do come with this extreme precision when it comes to killing. But it starts at the bottom. So this is the class character of the climate crisis, which is similar to economic crisis. Crisis hits downwards. And that's also a reason why the mainstream media, politicians, the bourgeois societies can often ignore the social consequences that always are so severe for working class. Okay. Nationalism. So when the economy is going relatively good, it looks like borders might disappear. But as soon as there is an economic or even ecological crisis, not least the pandemic, nationalism comes back. Borders come back, or borders are always there, but are reconfigured. And nationalism reappears when suddenly the ruling class comes to their nation to be saved. Going quickly, racism. When I started writing this book about economic and ecological crisis, I had a hypothesis that racism might be relevant in crises. After working with these two crises for the last 200 years, racism always comes. Always. I haven't found a single crisis where I cannot trace racism as in some core argument from the far right, right, or center right, or even social democrats sometimes. It comes in every single crisis. And this is partly, of course, the nature of crisis is complex in the sense that for us Marxists, we can go down and see that they're rooted in system. Imagine not being a Marxist. You cannot do that. You need to search, but you still need to find an explanation for the crisis. So you need to find it somewhere. It can be wars. It can be happening by chance, too much political regulations, etc. But racism is an easy way to go to. And as Stuart Hall says, it's where the crisis bites. Fascism. So relation between economic crisis and fascism is, of course, well discussed after the fascism in Italy and Germany. There's a lot of things to say about that. One thing I just want to add here is that, so the big question on the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany was, what kind of crisis produces these kind of regimes? It's often given with people like Pulanzas and others that this comes out of crisis, out of problems. Question was only what kind of crisis. So Nikos Pulanzas read about a political crisis, ecological crisis, economic crisis. The question today is, of course, climate crisis. Can climate crisis be added to that list? Is climate crisis a path towards fascism? And I think, sorry to say this, I think there's at least 3 ways of answering yes to that question. The first one is the classical fascism as a defense against progressive movements. What would happen if you actually had governments, say in the global north and in the whole world, actually wanting to stop global warming by 1.5 or even 2 degrees, actually doing what was necessary, actually starting closing coal mines, closing oil platforms, actually start banning air traffic, actually doing these kind of things we need? How would the far right react? How would the fossil fuel companies react? And we've already seen these alliances quite strong during the last decades, and will certainly develop and evolve into what we can call fossil fascism. The tendencies are already there. Another path towards fascism will be in the crisis itself. So if fascists now, we can discuss if Trump is fascist or not, but in more and more countries, they are getting power, they are getting stronger, and if this continues, if climate change comes with these shocks that need immediate response, and they are the ones holding power, and we know that the shocks comes with more racism, national chauvinism, etc., how can fascists use these shocks even to strengthen their own position? Last one is a bit different, and that we can call maybe eco-fascism. This is a little bit hypothetically today, because this is not the main tendency we see with Trump and the far right. But what if the far right suddenly says, okay, climate change is real. Humans did cause climate change. It was humans. Which humans will they blame? Certainly not the ones we are obviously seeing doing this, the company owners in the global north. They will blame someone else. And it could be Jews, like it always is, as a conspiracy. It could be Muslims, because there's a hype right now. It could be Chinese for geopolitical reasons. It could be people in Africa or India for overpopulation. It could be everything, but it will be some immigrant groups will be used racism against. No strength position. Okay. Okay, war is different. I'll skip a little bit short time, so I'll skip war, but it's also an interesting point. I also said there's ... under there. So this list is not final. It's just what I discussed in the book. I could also discuss, or if somebody's smarter than me, with more time than me, they could also write about imperialism, geopolitics, gender, social reproduction, and psychoanalysis, for example, and more topics that I do not discuss in the book. Doesn't mean it's less important. It just means that I didn't write about it. All right. So if we then put these two slides together, we kind of see the whole picture, and start to see the whole picture, and we can see different things. And I'm not going to go too far into it, but then we can start like seeing particular crises. You can place them different levels, and you can use these different points and to see different crises. Okay. Just going to make a few points. So with this way of seeing the levels of abstraction, we can see a few different things. We can see how the world is changing through crisis and not changing. How things are seemingly like everything solid melts into air at two levels, while at the other levels it's not. We can also see that crises, as I stressed in the beginning, are events and underlying processes, which means that any pure empirical analysis of crisis will not do it. Any pure philosophical take or theoretical take on crisis will not do it. This crisis itself forces us to go back and forth between empirical historical work and theoretical work. Now can I just add a few things on this list? One interesting thing with level 1 and 2 on economic crisis, for example, is in the 1970s, you had a ruling class who did everything to change level 2. So in 2008, very differently, you had a ruling class did everything that they could do to not change level 2. And what we're happening since is perhaps the ruling class understanding that level 2 need to be changed somehow, but only able or willing to do so if it's reproducing their class power and their privileges, which is very hard to find a new system with similar privileges as neoliberalism had. Okay. One more thing before I move on to the strategy part is that this way of seeing crisis also allows us to see what is a crisis and what's not a crisis. So if everything is not a crisis, we're living in these times of crisis, we need to shape it up and see, okay, does it happen on several levels or not? And why is this important? I think today, for example, the concept of immigration crisis is very interesting. So what Naomi Klein says in the shock doctrine is that sometimes things might appear like crisis, but they are not. So she don't use the same framework as me, but I'm stealing that because I think it's extremely insightful. It appears as a crisis, but it's man-made in the corridors of power. It can look like crisis. It's called a crisis in the media, but it's not embedded anywhere. It's just made up as a crisis in order for the ruling class or the politicians to change the world to their benefits. And this we can call a pseudo-crisis. And I would argue that immigration crisis is a pseudo-crisis. So racism exists bottom-up, of course, also, but as a crisis, especially in the US now, it comes top-down. And in those kind of situations, perhaps we must react differently to situations where there are real crises. Okay. And with that, I will move on to speak about how to respond to this kind of crisis. Because Naomi Klein says when there is a crisis, we should always meet this crisis with calmness. Stay calm. Don't be panicked because it's a crisis. And I think this might be true for, of course, it's hard to argue against staying calm, but this is a good insight in terms of pseudo-crisis. Like immigration crisis, it's about stay calm, keep communities together, resist racism, fascism, etc. Always be on offensive as well, but it's also about defending communities as we have them. But some crises are not pseudo-crises. Some crises are real. Say an economic crisis, when people lose homes, jobs, lives in a matter of days and weeks, or an ecological crisis when there are wildfires, when there are heat waves actually killing people we should not go around mobilizing the working class on staying calm. Opposite. I think we should need a socialist response to this kind of crisis. Okay, so, and what could that be? And just two things we should not do, or three things we should not do. One is just parenthesis. It's very hard to find people arguing we should ignore a crisis. But this was the position of the Italian Communist Party in 1975, when the economy was going into hell, and the Italian Communist Party like, don't look at this, ignore the crisis. It's taking the attention away from the real state of affairs, which was their way to power in Italy or something. But after that, of course, we've seen so many crises, it's very hard to ignore them. Another approach I disagree with is crisis as an opportunity. And this is a bit complex, because I'm quite hard on this. Crises are not opportunities, and it might sound very pessimistic. Maybe it is. I did rise when you asked about optimism, but here my arguments will get quite pessimistic. Because I know optimism, I don't find optimism in the crises themselves, but in the fact that we are humans. So a lot of people, as soon as the crisis comes with this is our chance. No, it's happening. But look at the history of crisis, it's always to our disadvantage. And there might be exceptions to the rule. Perhaps the Great Depression in the US is an exception. But if it is, we're talking about an exception. One exception, or maybe one in Sweden as well, but that's, I don't agree with that one. Okay. The main rule is quite clear. When crises hit, they reproduce society, and those working class are disbenefited. Environmental movements are disbenefited as soon as there's a crisis. So starting from this position, it's just a sober position to start from, and understand why this is the case. Then we can try to do our best to make an exception, because that's what we need to do, especially with climate change. We need to make an exception from hell on a general tendency that crises reproduce capitalism. So, as I said, liberals have different problems, because they have hard to understand the crisis, but they can use them politically to their advantage. But there is, I will agree that there is an opportunity intellectually for Marxists, because when there is a crisis, we see the world clearer, we see the structures that are making these things clearer. So it might be an intellectual opportunity for doing better research, if you like. But this is very, of course, I hope you agree, knowledge does not rule the world. Material interest and material drives or political contests do. So, I say something like, for Marxists, crises are intellectual opportunities, but political problems. For liberals, crises are intellectual problems, but political opportunities. And that's to our disadvantage, I must say. Okay, so another thing we mentioned, how to approach the crisis will be Keynesianism. So often when it comes to economic crisis, leftists run to Keynes as soon as there's a crisis. And we saw it maybe so much today, but only 2-3 years ago. Green New Deal had a similar impact on ecological crisis. And the magic formula for Green New Deal was, of course, we can solve both crises with the same policy instrument. Boost state investments, and that will solve both crises, because we need more money into the economy to solve the economic crisis. We need more investments in railways to solve the climate crisis. Everything's fine. And when I wrote the book, and the Green New Deal was a prominent discourse, I criticized it. But now it's more like I miss it, because now we have almost nothing in terms of social democratic policy resolution at all. But okay, let me say just this like a friendly critique. I think there's a lot of good things in Green New Deal. It might be a good way of articulating policies. And could be done more or less radical, of course. But as a friendly critique, I will say this. First, investments alone do not solve crises. Neither economic nor ecological ones. Economic crises need creative destructions, also need something be taken out of the economy. And for ecological crisis, it doesn't matter if we only have more of the good things, we also need less of the bad things. And this is the thing that's so much harder. It's very much hard, it's less there in Green New Deal, of course, than just in adding more railways or renewable energy. Second, Green New Deal. Okay, say if you, or Green Deal in the EU, but Green New Deal, say if you actually had this program of solving the both crises, one policy. And one of them succeeded, and the other one failed. Or you can see you're coming to a position where you need to compromise on one of them. Which one will have to wait? The ecological one. It's just given. It's given in the system we're working in that as soon as you have to choose between economy and ecology, ecology must wait. And that's given and also in the framework of Green New Deals. Because the Green New Deals is built on the premises that capitalism will be reproduced. And if you don't do that, you have poverty, you have all kind of social problems, which politicians cannot have, or we as humans also should not have. Third, say it did work. Say Green New Deal actually did work. It did solve or did lower the emissions, and it did increase economic growth. What kind of capitalism would it be? Because it would still be capitalism, but what kind of regime of accumulation I was speaking about? And then, as the previous presentation as well, of course, what kind of minerals are needed and what kind of contradictions do this come with? Because the unsustainable relation to nature will still be there. Fourth, there's a massive problem with the Green New Deal that this seems to be a win-win situation. And a win-win situation hides class conflicts. It hides the fact there are power relations we're speaking about, and they need to be confronted, not hidden. Fifth, and lastly, I do kind of agree with the argument that a Green New Deal could give us more time. That might be the case. I think Alicia Batustani said this in an interview. Her book on the Green New Deal is among the better ones. That with the Green New Deal, at least we can buy like 10, 20 years of time in order to make more radical changes. That might be the case. But it might also be the case that the Green New Deal or Green Keynesianism is the most civilized way of taking us into collapse and total destruction of the earth. We don't know. Okay. So what could a socialist response instead be then? What could that be? And, sorry. Am I talking too fast? Yes? You're not even having the headphones. Imagine those people with headphones. All right, I will speak slower. I try. Hard when I get into it. So what could a socialist response be? Given that crises come from different levels of abstraction, so must a response to the crisis. I think this is very important. So a socialist response must both address the actual needs on level 1 and the underlying contradictions. Difficult. Not impossible. Keynesians do this. So when there is a crisis, they always have an answer. So as soon as there's a crisis, they say, invest, boost consumption. It doesn't matter what the crisis looks like, but they have their answers ready. It comes directly. And this answer is related to how they see the economy. It's embedded in how they see the world. Neoliberals, same thing, at least until recently. When there was an economic or ecological crisis until recently, they always had the answer. Deregulate, privatize. And it came like this. And it is embedded in how they see the world. When there is an economic crisis or ecological crisis, we Marxists or socialists, we have the perfect analysis of why this occurs with all this contradiction in capitalism, but no idea what to do on level 1. How to do the actual basic policy management on level 1. So we argue in the book we need a crisis management, level 1, which is politicians making sure that people actually get houses and jobs and whatever, food. We need a crisis policy, which is more an idea about what to do in general before the crisis hits. And we need a crisis critique or crisis theory, which is more like I presented to understand the broader or the underlying processes. Okay. And I think the main thing, and I have a paper coming out in the journal Spectre in a few weeks called What Are We Waiting For? Socialist Reflections on the Next Economic Crisis, which is exactly about that. And I think the main thing, and this is about the economic crisis, but a similar thing can be said about ecological. I think the main thing is to be prepared. And to be prepared for the next crisis is absolutely crucial. if you don't have a plan for what socialists could do before the crisis, it's too late. Then we go to the Keynesians and just accept investments. But if we start preparing now, what could socialist ideas, rhetoric, propaganda, plan would be, then we might be prepared when it hits. Okay, like a socialist creative destruction, what kind of sectors do we want to see destroyed? Cryptocurrency, obviously, but how also to get rid of fossil fuel in that process? As a sector, they need to be destroyed in order for the capitalist or the economy to reinvent itself somehow. Might still be capitalist, but maybe not. What kind of companies do we want to see nationalized? What kind of companies should be more workers controlled? And if companies need bailout, okay, what kind of demands do we put on ownership and changes to production in terms of that? How can we make sure that actual people get actual food and housing directly as there is a crisis, or jobs? What kind of jobs will that be? When suddenly even the political center will start talking about investments, okay, how do we steer investments, and how do we make sure that these investments are what people need and might lower emissions, and not only what profit and the capital need, etc. These kind of questions must be made beforehand the crisis hit. Do they come after? I think it's too late. Okay. And of course, all crises come with a class character. What kind of class character do we want to see in the next crisis, economic or ecological crisis? And then I think the class consciousness, unconsciously, are rising. I think the hate against the rich, the billionaires, you can call them different things, billionaires, oligarchs, the 1%. I think the real hatred among people are growing in that direction, which can be articulated very progressively. So when next crisis hits, okay, make the billionaires pay. Stop the oligarchs from taking over democracy, etc. It can be an immediate demand for how to face the next crisis. All right. That's kind of my few thoughts on this socialist program, or what to face the crisis. I also want to say a few things before I end. Do I have like 5 minutes more? Okay. Can I use this one now? Because I'm going to read. All right. So, I'm going to end with a few reflections on the current discussion within eco-socialism and the path towards eco-socialism. So far, maybe a lot of you agree with what I've said. Now it's time to start, what's it called in English? Stepping on some people's toes. Are you ready? Nice. Okay, 7 thoughts on the path towards eco-socialism. 1, eco-socialism is the policy and theory for tomorrow, but we are haunted by some problems from yesterday. The current polarization within eco-socialism between eco-Marxism and degrowth is a problem. To put it bluntly, for eco-Marxists, modern industrialization is primarily progressive, and they tend to have a relatively positive view on growth, whereas the degrowth movement fundamentally critiques such ideas. These are 2 heterodox traditions, but they also represent distinct poles in a debate reflecting very different starting points for thinking and doing politics. Eco-Marxism, I argue, has always been a dominant position within Marxism. But this was perhaps less obvious as long as eco-Marxism existed as a sub-discipline in the basement within Marxism, primarily pursued by those with a personal interest in ecology. But with climate change, and especially over the last 10 years, this has changed. Now, everybody who wants to be taken seriously must have a position on the climate. When the main tendency within Marxism engage with ecology, we get eco-modernism. 2, the stark binaries between socialist eco-modernism and degrowth of necessary complexity. So, comrade Matt Huber posed some interesting questions in his book, Climate Change as Class War. For example, do we want the politics of less or a politics of more? Do we focus on production or consumption? Is the political subject that will stop global warming the working class or the professional managerial class? These are interesting questions, but the framing is problematic. We obviously need more of some things and less of others. I would agree that production is more important in many ways than consumption, But this does not mean that consumption is not also extremely important, analytically and politically. The core dichotomy we are expected to take side on is growth. This is both problematic and very confusing. People continue to refer to very different things when I talk about growth, and by extension, then degrowth. Does growth refer to biophysical or material throughput, energy use, human potential, capital accumulation, a human development index? Most often it's assumed we think about increase in GDP, but then how to measure that? 3, growth understood, for example, as always increase in GDP or biophysical throughput, is indeed a problem. But we cannot begin by confronting growth itself. Investments in new infrastructure will directly lead to increased economic activity, increased GDP in short term, of course. And this is, of course, not a valid argument against such policies. Instead, we need critical discussions about which sectors, places, industries should see more economic activity and which should be phased out or shut down. These are complex questions. They will differ over space and time. An eco-socialist movement seeking to mobilize beyond niche intellectual circles must provide concrete, place-specific answers. 4th, the discussion is not only about growth, it goes deeper. The disputes between eco-modernists and degrowth is tied to broader questions about whether modernization, industrialization, or capitalism itself is inherently progressive or reactionary. I think it's fair to argue that large-scale industry, new technologies, increased productivity, and urbanization have created possibilities for socialism that did not exist in pre-capitalist societies. From this perspective, we see how the development of productive forces and capitalism itself has produced the working class, also known as its grave diggers. But how far can we take this argument? If we look at the world today, does anyone see capitalism leading us towards socialism? Those arguing for capitalism's progressive character have certainly read a lot of Marxist literature, but this is not a conclusion one draws from observing reality, but mainly from reading. Capitalism is not advancing towards socialism. It's only taking us into a new geological epoch and climate disasters and genocides, wars, and always new crises, and so on. So eco-socialist thinkers in the 21st century should develop a better critique of productivism or uncritical celebration of growth than simply saying that it's bad. We need a more nuanced critique. We need to move past the binary of seeing modernity, capitalism, development, or growth as inherently progressive or reactionary. 5. Karl Marx. One striking aspect of the debate between eco-modernism and degrowthers is how actively both camps invoke Karl Marx to support their case. Eco-modernists have a sea of quotes to draw from, while degrowthers have less material, but make more out of what they have. Building on new Marxological evidence, Saito famously argued that the mature Marx was a degrowth communist. And we should continue to read Karl Marx for a number of reasons. His works remain the best starting point for understanding the roots of climate change. We cannot grasp global warming without understanding dynamics of the profit motive, capital accumulation, metabolic rifts, class struggle, and class fractions. But as Marxists, we must remind ourselves that just because Marx said something does not necessarily make it true. We should be cautious of the rhetorical exercise of first claiming that Marx really meant this or that, and then simply assuming that so should we. 6. Eco-socialism and class. The biggest problem with the polarization between degrowth and eco-modernism is that it hinders fruitful discussion about class struggle. Some eco-modernists argue there is an antagonistic relationship between the professional managerial class, PMC, and the working class, where the former has occupied environmental movement, while only the latter can truly change the world. This antagonism between a progressive working class and a reactionary professional class is mirrored, or rather inverted, by degrowthers. Tadzio Müllers, an excellent German activist, has argued that industrial workers in the global north will not only be our enemies, but our most efficient enemies. Here, conversation about class starts and ends often by pointing out that the workers in the global north have an imperial mode of living. And yes, there are indeed tensions between many trade unions and the environmental movements, but it's wrong to describe these as antagonisms. If that were the case, there would be a class struggle between the working class and the class that has so-called occupied the environmental movement. That is not the case. I think it's intellectual dishonest to ignore tensions between workers and progressive climate politics, as well as issues of racism and imperialism. But it's also politically hopeless to assume these tensions are so great that the working class, however defined, could or should not be the subject of struggle against global warming. It remains an absolute prerequisite for eco-socialists that organized labor, sometimes alienated by degrowth movement, and environmental movement, sometimes alienated by eco-modernists, are not only radicalized and strengthened, but also brought together. 7, and finally, climate activism is class struggle. The climate movement we see in our streets, occupying coal mines, organizing school strikes, is, I assume, maybe 99.9% composed of people who do not own any means of production. Yes, many might come from homes with pianos and bookshelves, but let's not allow Pierre Bourdieu to distract us from a clear class analysis. Class is not determined by aesthetics, taste, or culture, or education. Taste, aesthetic, and culture are certainly matters, for better and worse, when we try to change the world, but do not define class in society. We start from a classical Marxist position. People who do not accumulate capital are part of the broad and heterogeneous working class. This will be a way more. This will, of course, be this is a starting point. It will be way more complex when we get into matter, but there will be exceptions. But this is where we start from, and starting points matter. People in labor unions and those in environmental movements belong to the same broad and heterogeneous working class. And more than that, the main enemy named by the climate movement is the fossil fuel industry, a fraction of the capitalist class. This is class struggle. Now, that class consciousness is low, sometimes extremely low, within parts of the environmental movement is indeed a problem. This problem is compounded by eco-modernists and degrowthers who often discursively reproduce and celebrate the conflict. As eco-socialists, we have work to do. Whether the struggle to stop global warming unleashes its potential and is articulated and understood as class struggle depends on political struggles within the movement. Finally, bringing together the broad working class is not an easy task. This should not surprise us. That has been the case for 2 centuries. It's tempting to romanticize history and see the history of the working class as more homogeneous than it actually was. Questions of gender, racism, sexual orientation, nationalism, etc. were always, and still are, questions used by reactionary forces, even within our class, to divide the working class. Uniting the working class is a difficult task, but it's our task. So there are good examples to draw from in this respect. And I know many environmentalist activists do this, and even a few labor activists do this, trying to draw these 2 strings together. One is the Norwegian initiative from a think tank Manifest called couples therapy. And in Norway, this is, of course, a very, difficult task, given that this industrial labor are oil workers. But this kind of conversation has started, and it's very good. This project has brought together progressive environmental organizations and labor unions organizing in the oil industry to sit down and discuss what a future industrial policy in Norway could look like. However, when it comes to uniting the labor and climate movements, it remains the case that most of our attempts have failed. We have failed so many times over the past decades that it can be tempting to give up. But we won't and we cannot, because this is the beating heart of eco-socialism. Thank you.